Believing in Bitcoin takes study, but also a kind of faith. Not blind faith, but a little bit of faith. And I think that's something not a lot of people talk about. In this episode of Bitcoin for Millennials, I talk with Seb Bunney, author of The Hidden Cost of Money, about hope, values, and what it actually means to build a life around something that isn't 100% certain. Because here's the thing, right? Bitcoin is still an experiment. And Seb is really honest about that. He holds deep conviction and real intellectual humility at the same time. We get into how bad money narrows your whole life down to survival and how sound money can open it back up. And stick around to learn what he thinks are the biggest threats to Bitcoin and how we should move toward the future. If you're enjoying my content, it would mean a lot to me if you could subscribe to the channel and like my video to support my journey. Thanks a lot. Now let's dive in to this episode. All right, Seb Bunney, welcome back to Bitcoin for Millennial.
Oh man, Bram, I absolutely love these conversations, and we obviously have only just started recording, but we've already been speaking for 20 minutes on everything around the world, spirituality. We've already dove deep.
Should have clicked record earlier, but this is episode, I think, 268. I think you were here when it was 86 or something. So some time passed by. And I remember that, back then we really went deep on, why Bitcoin is the best money ever. I think I called it a money masterclass or something on YouTube. Just trying to help the YouTube algorithm, reach all the drop shippers to actually tell them what money is. Anyway, and I think with you, a conversation around what does actually understanding this, like what does that do to you, right? And you were very active, obviously, in your education with Looking Glass, your book, etc. But you kind of, went from trying to orange pill everyone to just living life a bit more. When did that kind of change? Like, what happened? Did you get discouraged, or was it another thing?
No, you know what? I would say that what discouraged me, and it was not Bitcoin, what discouraged me was just social media. I find that it's challenging in the world that we live in today. The medium at which we communicate with others is social media largely. And the problem with social media is that these feeds, these algorithms, they're obviously these companies want to make money, and they make money through eyeballs. And naturally, we know that negative news spreads faster than positive news. And so a lot of these algorithms are geared towards kind of like pushing negative sentiment. And what I just noticed is my mental health over time would start to get impacted. My curiosity was impacted. It was so much easier when I was bored to just quickly pull up Twitter and scan my feed, as opposed to kind of go into contemplation, start thinking about the world, thinking about where maybe I can add a little bit of a difference or whatnot. And so I just noticed that social media was really starting to detract from my ability to show up in life. And so I decided, when was it? I would say in December, January, I decided to kind of take a bit of a step back from social media. That's not to say that I've been completely absent, but I'd pop on maybe once every couple of weeks just to kind of have a quick checkup on what's happening. And from then, I've definitely noticed my mental health improved quite a bit. But at the same time, what you start to see when you step back from social media is you see the divisiveness of social media. And so coming back onto Bitcoin, it's been hard to even see the Bitcoin community so divided. It almost feels like there's a bit of a culture clash going on right now. And so seeing that and thinking about like, what is like my place in this? What is other people's place? Can we really make a difference? And maybe to kind of tie it back to something at which you had mentioned around orange pilling, I think a lot of us, we come into Bitcoin and we stumble down this rabbit hole and we're just like, oh my God, I think this thing could profoundly change the world we live in. I want to go and tell everyone about this thing, and we want to start orange pilling. So we start writing content, we start going on podcasts, we start going to conferences, we start telling our friends, we talk about it at dinner tables. And what I noticed is that it is almost impossible to orange pill someone. The only people that tend to get orange pilled are already curious about Bitcoin. And so it's almost like, for me, I've shifted towards trying to push Bitcoin to, when someone comes to me and they're curious about Bitcoin, I will open up the gates and I will share any information with them. We can have deep conversations. But the moment I start talking about Bitcoin, or someone asks me a question about Bitcoin, and I can see that they're simply just defensive and they're not interested in Bitcoin or curious, I just don't tend to even want to dive into that conversation, because I think that there's that famous saying, what resists will persist. And it's just like, if someone's resistant to Bitcoin and you end up just pushing Bitcoin, it's just going to persist. And so for me, I've kind of shifted my approach. And my approach is, when people are curious, I go deep down the rabbit hole. But outside of that, I tend to actually just focus on myself. And anyone who has kind of gone down the rabbit hole of psychology have probably stumbled across Carl Jung. And Carl Jung talks about how we have the collective unconscious. And when we are moving through life and experiencing life, this knowledge that we garner is passed through into the collective unconscious. And so I think we can make a bigger difference through actually just working on the self and optimizing our frequency, and that information is shared to the collective unconscious, as opposed to externally trying to push things and to change other people. And so that's kind of maybe where my energy is shifted. It's more shifted internally as opposed to externally.
Most people stop too early with Bitcoin. They buy it, maybe move it to a wallet and think they are done. But they're not. The real questions are how you're securing it, how private your setup is, and whether you're verifying your own transactions or trusting someone else. And what happens to your Bitcoin when something happens to you? This is the layer that most people ignore, and it's the most important one. That's why I've been working with the Bitcoin Way. They help you set up self-custody properly, including privacy, cybersecurity, inheritance, and even running your own node. And they do it without ever touching your Bitcoin. They're not a custodian, they're your support team. If you're serious about this like I am, go to thebitcoinway.com/Bram, that's BRAM, to book a free call. They'll walk you through your setup, personalize everything to you, and help you get a much stronger position very quickly, whether you're a beginner or more advanced. That's thebitcoinway.com/Bram. I keep coming back to is this idea of Bitcoin as a mirror. I don't know if we really talked about that before, but we just talked about, consciousness, fractal, stuff like that. And I do think this idea of Bitcoin as a mirror shows up in different places, right? Like Bitcoin functionally is a parallel money system with all of its characteristics being the total opposite of the money it's trying to replace. Or, well, the money that was the reason for, the creation of Bitcoin. It's like the total opposite, and it's this idea of this paradigm shift. Like, if you look at it from the fiat money point of view, a lot of properties of Bitcoin would sound pretty stupid, right? And people also use that as arguments. I mean, there's people that are proponents of infinite money printing, right? And they don't understand or agree with the idea that there should be a limited supply. But then when you move over, right, and you look back, then you can actually see a fuller picture, right? When you take that distance, but also that, and that's also, in a big part this podcast. There's a lot of people of our generation that are very nihilistic. They don't have hope for the future, right? They don't want to have kids and whatnot. Like, sometimes I lurk on millennial Reddit, right? And people are complaining and it's very negative, etc. And every time, basically, I just realize that I don't feel like that. And I also think that's in a big part due to having adopted Bitcoin and the values that come with that. But I also think that once you start aligning with that and start living from that, right, that is actually, hopefully, and I think it's how it works, but that is what people will see, right? So if you're living along the values that you've adopted, and it shows that it brings benefit to your life, and there are people that are perhaps a little bit more lost or just unaware or whatever, and they see that, right, that actually piques their interest, instead of starting with what is money, what is fiat, right? Or why don't you realize that in the name fiat money, it already says that it's just infinitely creatable money
100%.
from nothing, right? It's just there, like, it's literally in your face. But
I would expand on, like, as you're talking about the word see, though, I would expand on the word see and say that, like, not only do other people see what it is that you're up to, whether you've been able to afford a nicer lifestyle, but I also think that energetically, it's just how, when I think you spend more time looking inwards and dropping into the intuition, you'll notice, like, when you walk down the street, but you've never spoken to these people, and you can sense energetically whether or not you resonate with some people and not others. Sometimes you walk
Yeah.
along someone, you're just like, whoa, I get a weird energy from that person. And sometimes you walk along someone else and you're just like, that person seems really genuine. But you've never spoken to these people. And so I think that when we work on ourselves, I think that we alter how we show up, and that shifts energetically. And I think that that's where this information, that when we work on the self, that information is shared collectively. And that may sound unbelievably woo-woo, and there's probably people that are about to be like, you know what, we don't need to listen to this podcast, I'm going to turn it off. Except for the fact that there are many studies that have also proved this. There's a really interesting study that I came across a little while back. And this lady in the UK, she wanted to see if there was a collective unconscious. Is there information being shared to some form of substrate that sits underneath of kind of consciousness? And so what she did is she created a whole bunch of crosswords, and then she had a group take these crosswords, and she would time how long it took these individuals to complete the crossword. Then what she would do is she would have the crossword published in a national newspaper. This was in the UK. So you'd have millions of people doing this crossword. Then she'd have another group go and take the crossword that has now since been published in the newspaper, and they would obviously make sure that the new group has not currently seen the crossword or seen it and tried it. And every single time, the group that took the crossword post that going out in the newspaper and the first group taking the crossword, they would always solve the crossword faster, which tends to imply that they're getting access to some information. Wherever that information is, I don't know, but I find that really, really fascinating. And then people have probably also heard of the other, what is it called, the 100 monkey study, where they found monkeys on one island. They would wash their food. Well, one monkey would start washing its food because it was realized that, hey, if I wash my food and I wash off the sand, it's more appealing to eat. I don't have grit in my teeth. And another monkey would start doing it, and then another monkey would start doing it. And once it reached a certain collective mass of people, monkeys off the island started doing it that had never seen another monkey do this. And so I think that there is some information or substrate that sits below our awareness that we can tap into. And so I think when we work on the self, we're not just we're not just growing as an individual. I think we can grow as a community. And so that's where I think we don't have to just go out there and push things in the Bitcoin world. We don't have to go out and change the external world to make a difference in this world.
It's so funny because you're going on what I described as Bitcoin is a mirror, right? And while you're talking, I'm thinking you are talking about morphic resonance. Have you ever heard about that?
I recognize the name, but I couldn't talk to it.
Yeah, so it's so funny when I Googled what is morphic resonance just to read it out, right? First sentence, morphic resonance is a controversial hypothesis proposed by biologist Rupert Sheldrake. It's so funny when it says controversial, right? or contested, right? I always think like controversial for who, right? Like it's such an empty, like deemed by who, right? And well, if you listen to any Rupert Sheldrake talk for an hour, you will be extremely fascinated, or at least I was, right? But it suggests that all things from molecules to human beings inherit a collective memory from past members of their species or kind through invisible organizing structures called morphic fields, right? So it's about that everything is connected. And so I love talking with you because then we can explore, right? Like, because you're using words, I'm interpreting the words, right? And then I'm reading out another person's words because it's their thoughts that they shared, right? And I remember that last time when we talked, right? We really talked about that there's a function of money that is basically, or you talked about like how money is the way we express what we value, right? And so you're expressing like language what you deem important if you follow this line of thinking where, you know, your limited time and energy is transformed into this reward that you can spend on, which is basically time and energy is your productivity, right? That you can spend on other productivity, right? And so by doing what you do to get this reward, you're expressing what you think is valuable. That's where value proposition comes from, right? Whether it's your role at a company or the proposition of a company itself. And then you use that to say, hey, this is the thing I find important, right? And so I don't really know where I wanted to go, but just the whole maybe we can touch upon that, or maybe you have new thoughts around this, right? Like how you spend money is how you tell the world what you value.
It's you know what, like this, it's one of these things. Like when I was writing The Hidden Cost of Money, I was really thinking about like, what is money? Because there's always this question. There's even podcasts about it. Breedlove has his "What Is Money" podcast, and I think we've been asking this question for a long time, and I think money is far more than just a medium of exchange. It's not just this thing at which we buy things to be able to exist. I think that like money ultimately it is a medium of expression. It's how we express to the world what it is that we value. And the way that I see it is that like if we value the extreme sports, we value mountain biking, if we value being in the outdoors, we're going to go and put our money towards endeavors and products that allow us to get outside. If we value grass-fed beef and like organic vegetables, we're going to put our money towards those things. If we value cigarettes and microwave meals and we don't really care about life, I think where we spend our money is going to be a reflection of those things. And so if you look at where someone directs their capital, you can gain a good sense about what it is that they value. And I think that ultimately, I think one of the biggest cases for Bitcoin is that you have a decentralized, trustless, permissionless system that ultimately you spend your capital where you see fit. And I think that that means that value flows to where value is being created. And there's no one intercepting that and redirecting. And I think one of the challenging things with our current money, with fiat money, is that when we have a central bank, when you have someone who can print money, ultimately what they're doing is by printing money, expanding the money supply, you're creating inflation. But at a higher sense, what they're doing is they're taking your ability to direct your capital where you see fit, and they're spending it where they see fit. And so if you zoom out on an economy and you see, tons of capital seems to be flowing towards war, that must mean that society values war collectively. No, that doesn't mean that's what society values. It means that there is one entity that has governance over the flow of money and it's redirecting capital. Whereas I think if you remove that entity and you had a society built on Bitcoin, you would get a much more accurate picture about what society values, because you would see where people are directing capital, not where government is directing capital, which tends to be one of the largest buyers and sellers out there. And so I think that like on a deeper level, money is so important. It's fundamental, because I think that we're having our life force taken away from us because we're unable to direct our capital where we see fit. We're unable to direct our capital to the things at which we value as an individual.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the biggest thing I got from you last time was the sentence, all the money you own today is worth the most today, right? And I think it ties to what you said. Like, I think the initial thought of, hey, if a country is spending money on war, that must mean they find that important or valuable, right? And I think that would be a right way to think if the money wasn't infinite,
100%.
right? So if the money was not infinite and you would have a scarce amount of purchasing power, let's say, and you would go to war, you would be very comfortable with going to war, either because you have the men or the manpower, or like the machinery or the whatever, or you know your adversary is weak, or the price is really big, or whatever, right? You would have made a very, very conscious decision around probably the worst thing that you could have actually undertake, right? Where other humans would die. But the crazy part, and like 2-3 episodes back, I talked to Cole Walmsley about this. Like, why is it so difficult to actually have stability? I don't want to say stability, because that's also kind of like an illusion, but like let's call it clarity, right? Because if money is an expression, then creating more money and inflation and sometimes capital controls, or even today I saw the US might be buying stocks, or else everything is going to shit. That also caps the expression, because if money flows to certain companies, conceptually you would say these are valuable companies. They're doing something that creates value. Therefore, I want a piece of that so I can get a return, right? But if it's all fake, same with bonds, right? The Federal Reserve buying back bonds, it's not an actual reflection of the value, not price, but the value that people put on these bonds or these companies, right? So it misconstrues the actual reality of the situation. Whether the judgment of the balance sheet of the US is actually correctly asserted, right?
I
or
could not agree
or a
more.
company is valued in the right way. So it's the actual reality is being distorted by people that gain value from making more money, right? But it's distorted for the people that are actually looking around at their reality and think their country might, should go to war or participate in that or buy, do capital controls and buy stocks in companies, although that has never really been a good idea, right? So I think the core of my point or question is like, how do you look at that? Like the distortion of reality, and maybe then also the connection to Bitcoin. I have some thoughts around that too, but I'd love to get yours.
So there's a couple of things that come to mind, and the first thing is it's like if you look at a company has got like KPIs, key performance indicators that it looks at to determine like the health of the company. Which areas it's succeeding in, which areas we not, which areas can we improve in. And the thing is, if you come in and you're just like, you know what, we want to make this company on paper look great, so we're just going to tinker with the KPIs to make it look great. Well, then the problem is the managers, if they're looking at these KPIs and it's like, things look good, they don't know how to improve the company, even if the company is failing, because the information they need to determine change is false. And I think that that's what we're finding in our economy. A perfect example of this. So in Canada, I was actually talking to a neighbor the other day, and he's got one of these like Chevy electric vans, and I was like, man, these things look wild. Where did you get that from? And he was like, well, Canada decided that it wanted an electric van, but it wanted it to be made in Canada. So what did it do? It gave billions of dollars, and don't quote me on the numbers because I haven't looked into the actual dollar amounts, but he was like, it gave billions of dollars to Chevy to build a Chevy plant in Canada to make this specific van. And so immediately there is a problem there. This isn't coming from customer demand. This is simply just the government saying, hey, we want to have a van built in Canada. And so it gave dollars to Chevy. So Chevy built this plant. They made these vans. They had zero demand for them. So what do? The government stepped in and said, hey, we're going to give it was something like a $40,000 or $50,000 subsidy for people to go and buy this van. So basically, instead of being $80,000 to $90,000, it was $40,000 for the people that bought it the first year they released these vans. So there was a decent chunk of demand, but it was all artificial demand because
it's great. It's to achieve a paper reality probably as well, right? Like some
100%.
sort of model that someone put on paper and put a number on.
Totally. And then people that are looking at this that haven't done the research think, whoa, this is amazing. There must be demand for these vans. So they go and buy this van thinking, okay, there's longevity. I'm going to be able to get warranty, And then what ends up happening? The second year, there's no demand for the van. So Chevy decides we're going to close down the factory. So Canada has spent like a couple $2 billion on this plant only for Chevy to basically take that money, pay a whole bunch of workers, and then just disappear. And then all of a sudden, all of these people are left with these vans that they can't really get warranty on because there's nowhere to service the van. So you create this artificial demand for something that people don't want. Whereas if Chevy have wanted to actually go and build that plant, what they would need to see is, we've noticed that a whole bunch of Canadians are going and buying our vans from the States and bringing them up to Canada. There seems to be a ton of demand. Then you have something that's sustainable. And so I think that talking about kind of Bitcoin, why am I pro Bitcoin? Because I think that it removes money from those centralized entities and it allows capital to flow to where value is being created. At its absolute simplest, it allows capital to flow to where value is being created. And I think that is so unbelievably important because it means that we as individuals can determine what is it that society values. Does society value a Chevy electric van or not? And if people don't value something, then that company will wither away. They will not be able to survive. And I think central banking, government prevent that from taking place.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts there. It is literally creating a fake reality. Not even on the paper, right? In the physical space, there are people that get a job. There are people that are, building a factory. There are people making the car. The car is actually on the road. Like it's all actually created here, right? But, I think this is also. I don't want to go too far off, but let me know if you like it. Like As in, like, I believe this, but I want to go in steps. Like, I really want to see if we can share with people, like, how big this is or how deep this goes, right? Like, as in, people just follow the incentives that are in front of them, right? And what you're sharing in this future, I think you didn't say something that I do think is very important, right? I agree with, if we have Bitcoin, there's a better way to measure value, and you're gonna burn yourself, right? Maybe you do a project like this, you chuck in some Bitcoin, nobody wants to buy whatever you made, and you're like, that was kind of a dumb decision, and I'm gonna learn from that, right? And from there on, that forces you to be more conscious about the value of this money that you're using, right? But, and as I just said before, right, there's people that are proponents of infinite money printing. They are taking the road of the lesser resistance, right? It's extreme high time preference, right? Like this, like, oh, there's a policy for green energy, blah, blah, car or something. Hey, analyst guy, make a plan, right? Oh, the plan is 3 billion. We have 3 billion. We can even print more than 3. We can print 30 billion or whatever, right? So there are no limitations, right? And the fact that there are no limitations means you don't learn anything, right? It's similar as when you have a startup company and you get like $10 million for your idea without knowing if the idea is actually, a viable idea. You're never going to figure out if it's viable because you have no boundaries to be creative. Like, you're never forced, you're going to act upon the fact that you got money, so it must be a great idea and I'm going to grow or whatever. But if you and I put, 10K into a shared account, 10K in Bitcoin, of course, and we, investigate some startup idea, every day we're going to think about what type of decision we're going to make, right? Like, what information did we get? How did we get the information? Can we trust the information? Okay, do we go left or right? Okay, we go left, and that's the decision, right? And then we create our path. Like, you're forced to be creative when what you're using to, to pay for stuff is limited.
Mm-hmm.
But then if we make the translation to Bitcoin, right, like, it can be limited in fiat money, but in Bitcoin, if the way we can measure everything, there's also just going to be less stuff, but it's also going to be like really, really great, right? Because that what is great will then also be rewarded. I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but my point is, what do you think about the fact that it is like we have to zoom out to here? There's so many people that would rather go for the easy path than actually be confronted with the fact that they should deliver value in order to get some sort of reward. Like, I hope that makes sense. Like, I just wonder, we're so far away from where we could be, which is the opportunity, but I also think a huge, huge challenge. That's why orange pilling doesn't work, because everyone just thinks, especially in the Western world, we're rich, we have money, we're good.
Well, so I think that we're told that it's the easy path, but in reality, we're forced into this path because we have taken on too much debt. And so we have to continually print money to devalue the currency, because if we allow technology to drive down prices through like technological deflation, then naturally the whole system collapses based on how much debt we have. And so I think that the way that I see it is that even if the company is able to, like, let's say we have a lax monetary policy and money just keeps expanding, and people may say, well, when you have inflation, when you have monetary expansion, when you have artificially suppressed interest rates, it's phenomenal for technological growth, because a lot of these companies can borrow cheaply, and so that helps improve the potential for viability. And that, I think that's absolutely patently false, because I think what ends up happening instead is that people don't put skin in the game. People come up with like ideas that are so fanciful that they'd never ever really be able to could you really create that in the next 5 years, 10 years? And because you put limited skin in the game, you've never really proved like a minimum viable product. And then you're able to go to the bank, you're able to borrow $1 billion. That money, you may think that, oh, it's just a company borrowing $1 billion. It's like, no, if that $1 billion comes from somewhere, and it's either coming from someone else, or if the banks, they essentially print money from thin air, you're expanding the money supply. So essentially, we as individuals are subsidizing that bank's ability to be able to test its hypothesis. And so I think that when it comes to Bitcoin,
the next guy in basically at the next funding
100%.
round. Right?
So there's a reason why 99% of startups fail. And it's because they've never really put enough skin in the game to be able to test whether or not their product is viable.
Mhm.
And I think that what will happen underneath, say, Bitcoin, let's just say hypothetically, we move towards a Bitcoin standard. And at this point, most of the world is using Bitcoin. So ignore the big growth rates of Bitcoin. At the moment, people are projecting 30, 40% annualized growth and stuff. That's because we're still seeing adoption. But let's just take out adoption out of the picture. And if you were to have the world using a fixed money supply, so there's 21 million and the whole world is using that 21 million. I know Jeff Booth talks about this. Some other individuals talk about this, where technology is driving down prices, depending on the industry, at 5 to 15% per year. So that, let's take the middle bound of that, 10%. So that means that if you have a fixed supply, then naturally prices should fall at about 10% per year. So the other way of saying that is Bitcoin will grow its purchasing power at about 10% per year. What that means is that people aren't going to go out there and lend their money unless they think they're going to be able to outperform 10% growth per year. Now, that's a lot higher than these 1%, 2%, 3% interest rate loans. And what that means is if people want to go and create a little startup, they're going to have to put a lot more skin in the game before they're going to be able to borrow. And I think that we're going to have a lot higher success rates on companies. And I think that it's at that point we're going to actually see faster growth in technology in many ways. And I think we're going to see companies with a lot more integrity. I think we're going to have people that are a lot more grounded, because I think that when you live in this era of free money, I think there's a lot of people that take advantage of that free money and they just look to capitalize off of others. And so I think that Bitcoin shifts the incentive model of even the startup space, the technological space and such.
Every Bitcoiner hits this moment. You need cash, maybe for a house deposit, an emergency, or a tax bill, and you're staring at your stack thinking, do I really want to sell this? Here's the thing, you don't have to. You can borrow against your Bitcoin instead, so there's also no taxable event and your stack can keep on stacking. This is where Firefish comes in, a peer-to-peer marketplace for Bitcoin-backed loans. And Firefish is not a lender. They built a protocol that makes this all possible, which is exactly why they never, ever have to touch your Bitcoin. During your loan, your Bitcoin sits in an on-chain multisig secured by open source code. You can find offers for different amounts, durations, and rates at firefish.io. And when you decide to get a loan, you can use code BRAM to get 30% off your first loan's fees. That's firefish.io and code BRAM.
Yeah. Well, it's logical that people take advantage of that, right? That is, I think I talked with Max Kaiser about this and some others also. Just think the whole acceptance of the fact that you, as just the biological organism, basically, you're corrupted in a sense. You're corrupted towards your own self-preservation, basically, right? Like I'd rather want you to die than me to die right now. So if you have the option to use a corrupted system to your own benefit, the bar to not participating is pretty high, right? Like it's very enticing to follow that. And I think there are many people that follow that without even knowing it, like not even in a malicious way, just in a logical self-preservation type of way. But I agree with you that this. I would also think like it's a good thing if the reward is scarce and you have to try to deliver value. You will also figure out if your idea sucks, which is absolutely fine, because you're still alive and you can do the next thing, right? There's so many people, and I think this ties into just the whole psychological aspect of the effect of fiat money. It's just like a lot of people do stuff they don't like.
Totally.
They buy stuff they don't like, right? And like all that stuff permeates. But one more thing, like a critic would say, but we have SpaceX and we have crazy stuff and life is better than 20 years ago, and less babies die and etc. and less hunger and all these things, which is true. But I think the main point is, and this is also I think why a lot of people don't go to Bitcoin like us, is like, imagine where we could have been, right? And my example with that is always like, these pictures of the future, right? Like in the 1910s or 20s, they asked people like, what does the year 2000 look like? Crazy stuff, dude. Crazy ideas that we do not have, right? And so from their perspective, back then, that's how they envisioned the future, right? In that little sliver of hard money time when they lived in the early 1900s. But that was their perspective to look at to the future. And now there are people that don't have children because they're nihilistic about the future. Like, what a difference between, in 100 years.
Totally. And I think there's a point that you kind of like touched on very briefly, and that's this idea that people will always fail. There's always going to be business ideas and startups that people are going to start and they're going to fail. But I think it's more important that the individual fails than the bigger the company gets, the more detrimental to society that failure becomes. And I think that if you look at any system in nature, there is not a single system in nature that if one entity goes down, the whole system fails. That just doesn't exist in nature. And any system in nature is distributed enough to protect itself. But we don't do that as humans. Unfortunately, our monetary system enables these companies to become so grand and so big that, as they say during 2008, if one of these companies were to go under, if Lehman Brothers were to like go down or whatever, oh my God, this could be the end of the financial sector. You know what I mean? And it's, I think that we're creating too much centralization in these entities. And I think that by enabling things to fail earlier on, we minimize the systemic risk of these things.
What you're saying reminds me of this idea that, if fiat money is literally an invention, right? It is not an organic way of getting to the most broadly accepted money. Obviously, Bitcoin is an invention / discovery, but it is a permissionless protocol that anyone can adopt, right? And fiat money is something that you are forced to adopt. I also like the word or the term like political currency, right? That's also a great one, right? Like, you're forced to adopt it. Like, you have to use it. That by itself, I think, is already interesting, in terms of just aligning with nature and how nature works. I've had these thoughts around how fiat money, because you can just create it, also just creates this idea that the entire reality is malleable just by using this thing that came out of nothing, right? And if you then compare that to how nature actually works, that's not how it works. Like, you cannot create the energy from nothing, right? You cannot just introduce something new in an ecosystem and expect that, all the actors or participants in this ecosystem will actually find it interesting or use it or that it has any value, right? And so this thought that I have is just around like just this introduction of fiat money. We talked about creates this distorted reality, but also a huge disconnect with just nature itself, right? With just our alignment in the experience of being a human being, whether you think that has a big spiritual part or not, right? Just that I find interesting because, if you grow up in a Western country like we did, then everything also just worked, right? So I feel like, again, we are just very far away from where we could be. And I just wonder how you think about that challenge. Because another thought I've had is that, maybe what we're trying to do, telling other people about Bitcoin or exploring these thoughts, is maybe just like back in the day, like way, way back, where people built cathedrals that they never saw after they died. I sometimes feel like that about Bitcoin. That is just such a big undertaking. It's such a big challenge that, maybe we're not even doing this for ourselves.
And I don't, it's a tough one. I don't want to get too like controversial because I understand there's a lot of divide right now, which is taking place in Bitcoin. And I think that where I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and there's this idea, most people in the community have heard about the whole idea of hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. And it's kind of like this, like cyclical fourth turning kind of effect. You have people that they go to war because they want to create change. And then you see the people that are after war and they're like, oh no, that was heinous, the outcome of that. Like, we want to be more pacifist. Let's get together. And you kind of see collectivism out of that. Then you see the people that are 2 generations away from war and they're just like, oh man, you start to see society start to decay again. And then you see the same cycle repeat again. And so I think that in many ways I see the same thing taking place in Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is not immune to changes. And I think that like hard times create builders. Satoshi was a builder. Satoshi was someone who saw what was happening during 2008 and for the years that led up to 2008, and he built Bitcoin. And then builders create resilient systems, and then resilient systems are what create prosperity. And Bitcoin has created so much prosperity that has attracted all these participants that didn't experience the same problems that the system was built to solve. And I think that over time, the system's founding ethos begins to fade. And this isn't because I think people are just malicious. I think it's just because they just don't carry the same lived experience that Satoshi or even a lot of the cypherpunks had. And I think that every cycle, Bitcoin inherits new capital and new developers and new companies and new users, but it also loses a lot of people who remember why certain design decisions were made in the first place. And so I think that one of the challenges at which we're facing is that every kind of 4-year cycle, because Bitcoin is a monetary technology, some of these people are becoming totally financially secure. And because of that, maybe they don't want to be in the public eye. And so they're stepping back. And so then there's a new wave of Bitcoiners. And so the people that come into Bitcoin see this new wave of Bitcoiners that came in just before them and think that that is Bitcoin. And so I think that it's like, how do we as a community, if we want this thing to last, if we want to keep this beach in perfect condition, and we don't want to freaking just party on the beach, have garbage on the beach, just burn the beach, like, how do we keep this beach pristine, and how do we ensure that we carry Bitcoin forward for the next 100, 150 years? And I think that it's a really tough decision that I've been thinking a lot about recently, given the conflict that's been going on in Bitcoin. What does that look like? You know what I mean?
I like that. That's very interesting. Well, I think we should talk more about this stuff than about the price. That's one. Yeah, that's a great idea. Like a Bitcoin foundation or whatever, right? Like not even in a sense of like an actual foundation, but more just the foundation. What are the talking points? What's the mandatory knowledge? What is the... It's funny, we're going into cult territory, right? Like, what's the initiation? Right? I got an email from Yoni Appelberg. I had a really interesting talk with him about how Bitcoin is an economic psychedelic, and that's how he talks about it, right? And the comparison is just what we talked about. A lot of people don't think about money; they just think it's the organic thing. They just use it, whatever. At one point, they wake up to the fact that it is manipulated by a small group of people that doesn't care about your individual prosperity, and then they're like, okay, once you see that, you cannot unsee that, right? And so he makes this comparison with psychedelics in terms of the reality. And at one point I asked him, sometimes people say like Bitcoin is a cult, and I always jokingly reply, well, if Bitcoin was a cult, right, it would be the only cult in the world that invites you to think for yourself and not trust others, right? And I still like that. But he said, no, maybe it's like a religion. I'm like, oh, okay, what do you mean? And then he started talking, right? Like, you have a Genesis, you have a deity, which is Satoshi, right? You have you have a scripture, which is the white paper. Like, you have all these, and he mentioned like 10 things. And I was like, wow, okay, this comes actually pretty close to... I think religion is a bad word because it's just misinterpreted or interpreted in so many different ways by people. So I think it's more a way, it's almost like a life ideology or something like that, that you kind of can align with. But it does have to work in order for it to propagate, right? Does that make sense? Like for every cycle, like you said, right, there's a new group of people that find Bitcoin, and then some people drop off, some people stay, and it's always like a little step change. But if we really think that a future world of hard money would actually bring in abundance and more, universal spiritual alignment, whatever, then it needs to be told for a very, very long time. And so I agree with you that has to revolve around something, because now, or maybe that's also how it goes, right? Like, all education is extremely decentralized, right? So and maybe that's also a good thing. But I agree with you that it's also a threat in a sense that, well, literally, what's the common thread? Right? What is the what what is it? But the fun thing is then also that Bitcoin is different for everyone. everyone.
When I think Bitcoin, the way people use Bitcoin and what Bitcoin means to them and the utility Bitcoin offers is different for everyone. But I do not believe that Bitcoin's functionality is different for everyone. Bitcoin needs to have a core set of rules, you know what I mean? And that's what makes Bitcoin powerful.
Yes.
And so I think that it's just like, how do we, like the reason why I think these religions have outlasted any company out there is because they've been able to tell a story and pass down like a moral framework. And I think that maybe to kind of what you're talking about, the comparisons between Bitcoin and religion, and I agree. I think that religion has the word religion has had such a kind of bad association over time that I think a lot of people hearing this will be like, oh, why are you comparing it to religion? But I think that there are many benefits to religion, and in many ways, religion has been a way for people to pass down a moral framework to their kids, to their grandkids over thousands of years. And I think that Bitcoin is the same in many ways. It teaches people about collaboration. It teaches people about honesty. It teaches people about integrity. There's no, if you're a miner, it doesn't make sense to go against the rule set and take advantage of the system. And so I think that in many ways, it's teaching people a set of rules or principles at which to kind of show up. And you see that in just how Bitcoiners show up in life. And so I think that how do we ensure that Bitcoin outlasts us and lasts for 100+ years? And that's not only on a cultural sense, how do we ensure Bitcoin kind of lasts and telling these stories, but also on a technical sense, how do we ensure people can run nodes? How do we ensure this thing doesn't open up attack vectors on a technical sense? And so that's where it's like, I find it, when I think about this stuff, I think that a strong nation is a nation that has a collective identity. And I think that Bitcoin, ultimately, I think maybe what we're suffering from at the moment is we have lost a little bit of our identity. It has been maybe diluted. There's been more and more entities come into Bitcoin with an idea about what they want to make Bitcoin. And so I think that it's about like maybe refining, like, who are we and where do we come from and how do we continue to carry those values forward? Because Bitcoin, it's only been, 17 years since 2009, since Bitcoin was founded. It's only been 17 years. That's tiny in the grand scheme of things. How do we ensure that this thing moves forward for centuries? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I agree, right? Like, I think two things, like just conceptually, I think Bitcoin can never die. Just this whole, just white paper wise, right? In a sense that, the concept of a decentralized money in this form, right? Solving Byzantine general problem, right? Creating trust between nodes basically that don't know each other, etc. Like the decentralized consensus, the Nakamoto, the equilibrium, stuff like that. That is proven that it conceptually works, right? And even if in 10 years, I don't know, something happens and all the hash rate dies and whatever, right? Like, even if there's 2 copies of the ledger that survive, right? Bitcoin survives. Even if it all disappears, could you start it again? Probably not, because there would be a lot of attacks on this early stage of the life. But if that doesn't happen, you could actually start it again, right? So that's what I mean with, like, the concept would never die, and that I find very interesting, because already the concept shows, kind of like pokes holes in the fiat money concept and everything that it touches, right? So I do think that will survive. I agree with you. Technically, implementation wise, there's a set of rules, and that is what is basically the anchor point, right? Like the rules of the protocol, from which all the other properties, I would say, emanate, and from there the values, like what is actually the impact of when if it works like that, what is then actually the impact in the real world, in the context of money, finance, blah blah blah, value, assets, all these things. it's funny that we talk about this because I've been thinking about this a lot, right? Like if you have a child, like would you tell them something you think isn't valuable or not true, right? Like you wouldn't do that. So things that people say today or things that people believe today, especially people things that are 1,000 years old, like you don't have to align with that, but there is a sense of truth in that because over generations people have deemed this valuable enough to teach their children, right? And so if your parents would have told you something that you think is utter nonsense, you would never tell your kids, right? So if something propagates over 2,000 plus years, there is a truth in that. You might not believe it, right? But there's a big enough group of people that are actually making sure that certain ideas, rules, rituals, symbols, whatever, are kept alive because they do find value in using them. And so again, if we put that in the context of Bitcoin, these 17 years, right? It's extremely early, extremely early. And I like that we went here because for me, this is the size of the battle. This is what I find so fascinating, right? The fact that if you think about this in this way, and I really hope we convey it in the right way, it's so fast, it's so extremely fascinating because
Mm-hmm.
if not this, then what? Fiat slavery, CBD slavery, like what? Right? Like what is the other side of not trying to attempt this? It's very dystopian for me, at least. So yeah, what do you think about that? Like that is positive and negative at the same time, perhaps.
Well, what comes to mind as you're talking about this, and again going back to kind of stories, I find it really fascinating that like when you look at any of these movements, whether it is the hippie movement, maybe it's even talking about like the goths, these kind of like kind of culture, alternative cultures and stuff. Most of these movements only ever last 1 or 2 generations. Now, why is that? It's because it's a peer movement. The hippie movement has almost pretty much died out within a couple generations. It was in the 60s, 70s, and it's almost died out. And then you look in the school system and you see, like when I was a kid, everyone wanted to be gothic. How many people are gothic these days? Very few of them have the black clothing, black eyeliner, black long hair. Like it's very hard for them to be able to kind of really start a movement that spans multiple generations. And I think that it's just because it's a small peer movement. And I think that when you look at what are these cultures that have been able to pass down stories for not just 100 years, not just 1,000 years? Take the Aborigines. The Aborigines in Australia, there's some evidence that they've been telling the same stories for 70 plus thousand years. That is just like mind blowing. Like, how have they managed to be able to tell stories across 70,000 plus years? And I think that what it is that you are interacting across multiple generations. And so kids are talking to their parents, they're talking to their grandparents, and they all recognize the importance of
Yes.
this thing. And so
Yeah.
I think that it's like so important. And I think it is what is happening in Bitcoin. I think we've got to really focus on integrating Bitcoin across these generations, whether it is the kids understanding why Bitcoin is important, the millennials, the current generations that are in the workforce understanding why Bitcoin is important, the grandparents understanding why Bitcoin is important, savings for their pensions, you name it. And so I think that in many ways, when you have the multi-generational stories, I think that it's much easier to pass it down as opposed to it gets lost with a single generation.
Yeah. This is a great, you're teeing up my question around, okay, but some people would say, nowadays when they're all fighting and discussing and whatever, which I think is high time preference, but we're all interested. We all want to see this succeed in whatever way we envision the future, like we're talking about, or something else. It's $100 million a coin, whatever, like whatever your perspective is, right? I do think a lot of people are distracted with the thing of today, right? There's several subjects I think, right, whether some people should do some stuff on the chain or not, or who's buying or selling, or whatever. What I like to go back to ties into what we talked about, I think, is that the whole thing for me, like this hope, this idea of some sort of idealistic hard money future, basically, right? um it also asks a little faith or something in the good thing, right? Like it kind of rests on this belief that Bitcoin just keeps on doing what it's doing, right? Staying decentralized and secure, but nothing is 100% certain, right? So even though a lot of people have figured out what Bitcoin is, and they hope that a lot of other people will also figure it out, I do think that there's also a lot of people that are disappointed that these other people haven't figured it out, right? And then, they need, there's action bias or whatever. Like they need stuff to do. They need stuff to say. They need people to point at or whatever. And I just keep coming back to, okay, this is not 100% certain. This is still an experiment in many ways, right? So how do you balance that kind of like conviction, but also the I don't know, the honesty about what's happening, or that you should zoom out or just chill or whatever, or have a little faith? Like how do you think through that?
I really struggle with this. This is something that I really, really struggle with, because there's a part of me that's just like, I'm not a developer. And although I built a few websites, I have a basic understanding of code. If I really study this stuff, I can maybe start to form like an average opinion, not a deep opinion, because that's just not my area of expertise. And so there's a part of me I'm just like, I tend to look at things from like a moral and ideological standpoint, as opposed to a technical, like deep technical standpoint. And I think that one of the things that I'm really thinking about at the moment, and this is kind of maybe where this divide that is taking place in Bitcoin, is that I agree that Bitcoin, in the long term, I think Bitcoin is going to be totally fine, as you say. However, I also can see the other approach, which is, no, but as a community, we are also what shaped Bitcoin. And so we should be vocal about what we believe in. And so maybe an analogy which I think about is like, imagine, like, take the pyramid. I don't know how long it took to build. Let's say it took 150 years to build. Imagine if when they started building the pyramid, they were like, okay, these blocks on the pyramid need to be 5 meters by 5 meters, but they can have a tolerance of, I don't know, like 10 centimeters. And then 5 years in, people are just like, oh, have I lost you? There you are. Oh, when it comes to these blocks, it doesn't actually matter if they have a tolerance of 5, 10 centimeters. They can be, let's say they can be anywhere between like 4 meters to 6 meters. And then another 5 years later, they can be anywhere from kind of 3 meters to 8 meters. And all of a sudden, as the pyramid kind of grows and grows and grows, you notice it completely lacks structural integrity, because all of the blocks are different sizes. None of it fits together, and the thing collapses. The pyramid collapses. And I think that they had a strong vision from the start about what they wanted this pyramid to be, and they were able to build it with tight tolerance. And I think that when I think about Bitcoin, I think that the more use cases we add on top of Bitcoin, the more we allow Bitcoin to deviate from its monetary focus, I think that we not only increase attack vectors, but I also think that we bloat the chain so that it minimizes the chance that it can be a decentralized, like it can run on this kind of distributed network of nodes, because the average node just can't afford to basically buy a solid state drive to be able to run a node. And so I think that the way that I see it is, if we actually want to look out 100 years, we've got to look at how do we keep Bitcoin as clean and focused as possible so that we maximize its structural integrity. And so I'm trying not to make it technical, because I think that there's arguments on both sides as to, but this and but that, and you can get a lot of pushback. But I think that ultimately, the way that I see Bitcoin is just like, how do we ensure that we build something that's structurally integral and we minimize attack surface? And I don't know necessarily what the arguments, I wish I was deeper or more familiar with the technical aspect of that.
It's not a positive outlook, to be honest. Right? Like,
Well, no,
I think, well, no, wait, I think that's the biggest challenge.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, right? Because we talked about Byzantine general problem. Like, okay, you create trust in a decentralized way and consensus in a decentralized way in the technical part, but that also needs to happen in the social part, in the human capital part, right? And we talked about education, but I think it's also this kind of like the stewardship over the technology, right? Like just zoom out even more, like in 50 years, who's maintaining the code? Who's talking about Bitcoin, right? Like, are our children going to do that? Like, what does that look like?
No, and I think that it goes back to this idea that you often hear people say, "Oh, there's no room for feelings in Bitcoin because it's code, and it's mathematics, and it's just these technical rules." And I wholeheartedly disagree, because the reason why people are in Bitcoin is because it's a social system of people that believe in these rules because it upholds certain values. You know what I
Yes.
mean? And so it's just
Yeah.
like, I think that as a society, I think we need to continually tell these stories so that people understand why they're in Bitcoin. They don't need to understand the code deeply. Like, it's great if you do. The more people that understand the code, awesome. It minimizes attack surfaces. But I think that as long as people from an ideological standpoint are just like, why am I in Bitcoin? Like, I think that that is incredibly important. And I think that there's a part of me right now that I think the reason why we're at this kind of fork in the road almost is simply because I think that these stories, we've kind of lost our way a little bit with these stories. And I think that, again, as society breaks down, and when I say breakdown, I'm not meaning that we're moving towards Mad Max. I'm more meaning that as money breaks down and it loses purchasing power, people continually look for the shiny toys. And right
Yes.
now, we've had this shiny toy, which has been AI, and it's sucked in so much of the capital over the last little while. And so Bitcoin is kind of underperformed in relation to a lot of other things for many reasons: AI, dividedness, you name it, OGs selling. I think that because of that, I think some people are quite disheartened right now. And I think that what we need as a community is just to find that cohesiveness again and those narratives, that why we're here in the first place. Because I don't think the story has ever changed. For me, it's never changed. Like, I think
No, me neither. Yeah.
if we
Yeah.
fix money, I think we fix so many of the challenges that we have in this world. You know what I mean? And I think that that is the most important thing. The whole financial sector pretty much exists because of broken money. Whereas if we have sound money, I think people will have far greater capacity to focus on what is important to them, to be able to show up for themselves, focus on their families. So it's like, let's get back to the goal of freaking focusing on how do we build like censorship resistant money that allows the future societies and the future generations to be able to prosper.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe to tie it all together, we talked about religion, or this agreement on a set of rules that in many different aspects that propagate through time and space because they are deemed valuable enough, right? Is something that has happened for a long time. But you've also shared this idea that once people drift away from religion, right, or this cohesiveness, let's say, right, which runs on trust and belief and faith and understanding, right? People go toward the state, right? They outsource their responsibility. They want to be saved by other people, know better than them, right? A similar thing in the financial world. And then Bitcoin comes in. If fiat money creates chaos, then yeah, I call Bitcoin it's ultimate order, right? It's the highest form of ordered information to ever exist, and that and you can verify that for yourself, which is a very important addition, right? So that brings a lot of things, right? That's part of the paradigm shift or the parallel world or Bitcoin as a mirror, so to say. It is extremely honest, accountable, right? It asks to be protected, like you just alluded to. And we can all do that individually, right? So it's kind of like, to take another step at it, it's kind of like that religion, but you can even verify it for yourself, which maybe is also the case in religion because you have your own relationship with your God, right? So maybe in that sense, you verify that relationship with your God also by yourself, right? Yeah, like where does that lead? Is that strong enough, you think, toward the future? Or if it becomes chaotic, if it's really like fourth turning, right, and becomes really chaotic, is that also an opportunity to get more people in the, I don't know, NPC, distracted, whatever state?
I think that in any situation throughout history, there's always going to be people, regardless of whether society is thriving or not, there's always going to be people that are able to look ahead, whether it's Gandhi, for, I don't know, Martin Luther King, like these people that are looking at these systems and they're willing to stand up and say, hey, this isn't right. I think this is where we need to direct our energy towards. And I think that for the average person, however, most of the time, they only create change when the pain of existing in the current system is greater than the pain of change. And so I think that as long as we have enough people when times are average, good, not so good, but not bad, as long as we have enough people that are able to tell these stories and explain why we need sound money, I think that Bitcoin will continue to thrive. And I think that that's the thing, is we're always going to have these lulls where I think Bitcoin maybe underperforms on a financial sense, and that's when people kind of disappear. But I think in the fourth turning cycle, where we talked about kind of strong men create hard times and all that kind of stuff, I think that what that means is from the Bitcoin times is hard times create builders. And as people come in and they make Bitcoin kind of more resilient and they tinker with it or whatever Bitcoin needs to be able to kind of improve that resiliency. So I think that in the long term, like maybe to your point earlier, bring it back to, I have no doubt that Bitcoin is going to thrive, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to be a rocky road. And that doesn't mean that there may not be forks in the short term and people may move over to other chains thinking that that is the core chain that everybody is the original ethos of Bitcoin is kind of built upon, only to realize that it isn't. I think that we're always going to find some of these kind of these rocky roads. And so ultimately, I don't know, maybe to to wrap it up, I think the last little while, the last 6 months has really tested me, not in my conviction for why we need Bitcoin, but it's made me think a lot about Bitcoin and narratives, Bitcoin as a community. Does the Bitcoin community have a strong like identity? And I think that it has in previous cycles. And this is the first cycle I've seen that identity fracture a little bit. And what does it look like to kind of find that cohesivity again?
Yeah. Would you agree that that maybe should bring us back to this bigger picture thinking? Literally what you're saying. I have similar thoughts on that. Like it is a big undertaking and it is a rocky road, but I do think there's also a lot on our side. Also what we talked about, right? From the technology to the decaying thing that it's trying to replace it, right? That is mathematically assured to take place. So I do also think there's a lot going for us. So yeah, my idea is more the bigger picture. Like eventually, I think everyone will fill it in their own personal way, whether they're writing a book or doing a podcast or whatever, right? But it's really about like the why and the attached time frame, and I think that would help in not being distracted by whatever rando 321 says on X.
No, I fully agree. And I also think that it goes back to what we're talking about at the very start, which is I was talking about how you can never orange pill someone. And is that the same in the Bitcoin community where it's like you can never really change someone's opinion? So why don't you just focus on yourself and keep doing? And then it's just like, does Bitcoin, what do they always say? Like, Bitcoin doesn't matter what you think, you know what I mean? And so it's just like, can you really make a difference in Bitcoin? Is Bitcoin just going to kind of meander along, you know what I mean? And do we just need to focus on ourselves? And Bitcoin's going to keep doing what it's doing. And as long as we uphold those values in our own life, I think that is staying true to Bitcoin, you know what I mean?
I fully agree. Well, I think that's a nice ender. Thank you so much. I hope people enjoyed this exploration together.
I feel like we jumped out a couple different paths, and yeah, it was, as always, like I really enjoyed chatting, Bram. I think you're a phenomenal individual, and the community is so lucky to have you.
Likewise, man. Thank you so much. Cheers.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, you can click here to find more just like it, and click here to find all Bitcoin for Millennials podcast episodes. Also, if you want to help me shine a light on the message of Bitcoin, please like this video and subscribe to stay connected. I hope to see you for our next episode. Bye.